Greetings. We're ready to begin the second half of the lecture material for this class. The first half we talked about measurement and how we can ensure that we have reliable and valid tools. Now we're going to talk about the actual process, when we utilize the different tools, and we'll talk about varieties of tools, and then how do we ultimately make a decision about who is the best person to hire. So when we're ready to, we've got our measures, they're all really accurate, we're really comfortable with them. We have two objectives when we're ready to hire. We want to match somebody to the job, which means we need to know that their knowledge, skills, and ability matches the needs of the company. We would have to then decide what selection tool will we use to decide what knowledge, skills, and abilities are needed. Then the other aspect is matching the person to the organization. Will that person fit into the culture? Will they be comfortable with the organization? That's a little harder to do. In fact, we don't know what kind of culture we're going to work in until we get in there sometimes. So our goal in the hiring process is we want to try to get at people's values and their work ethic and things like that to see if it's consistent with the values and the work ethic of the organization. This is much more challenging, but it's absolutely doable. So there's a number of different tests that we can use, and we use some initial screening tools for people to determine whether or not we want them to work in the company. We might look at resumes, applications, immigrant I-9 forms, and interest inventories, right? The applications are getting at information that I want as the hiring manager. And the resume is the way that you present your information. Now, there might be similar information in the two, but I want you, as a job applicant, to give me your resume, but I also want you to fill out an application blank, because this way I have consistent ways to compare candidates, because everybody's resume is different, right? So if I have applications, the applications are the same, and all I have to do is look at questions to see how people answer them differently. Resumes are really good for me, though, because it tells me how you present yourself. It gives me an insight into the way that you're choosing to present who you are and how I'm supposed to look at you. So you might design it in a particular way, have a particular kind of paper, or a particular kind of font that really is great at emphasizing what how you want to be presented to people. So they compare and contrast in that way. Second, we've got we have the immigration or the I-9 forms. The immigration or I-9 forms determine whether or not someone is eligible to work in the United States. And basically we're looking for, is someone a citizen, either naturalized or they went through the citizenship process, or do they have a green card, can they work here, or do they have a visa and they're eligible to work here even if they're not a citizen or on their way towards citizenship. If they don't have any of those documents, they're not eligible to work in the United States, and it's very important that we have these I-9 forms collected. We are obligated under the law to collect that information. Interest inventories are also another way that we can assess whether or not the interests of the individual are going to match sort of the values of the company. And so we can learn a lot about people's values and about their personality by looking at interest inventories. And the hope is that these interest inventories will give us some insight into whether or not this person will fit into the culture of our company. So it's a tool we can use for screening. Once we have made this determination about applications and pre-screened people, then we get into more substantive tests, which are more expensive. One thing that we can do is an interview. Most of us have experienced interviews at one level or another, and most of us have experienced unstructured interviews, which means you just got in, you sat down, you had a conversation, and they maybe asked you a few questions, and then you sort of digressed off on conversations about college or high school or a hobby that you were involved in. And the problem with an unstructured interview is it makes it very difficult for me to compare candidates. Because if I have one conversation with someone that talked about their grades, and I have another conversation with someone that talked about some of their hobbies, and another conversation with someone that talks about their favorite sports team, it's really difficult for me to decide which one is going to be the best candidate for the job because I don't have similar information to compare. A structured interview, and as I mentioned before when we talked about panel interviews or parallel forms interviews, is we want to make sure that we're asking the same questions of everybody. So that I ask candidate 1 a question, candidate 2 a question, candidate 3 a question, all the same questions, and then I get a variety of answers from them. And once I get that information, then I'm much better able to make a decision who I want to hire for the job. So, what are some of the problems with validity? Of course, structure is a big problem with validity. If I don't have structure, I'm going to have lower validity in my selection tools. All right, and the same thing, I'm going to have lower reliability as well. Sometimes I make snap judgments where someone comes in, they answer a question, and I'm either going to say, oh, I love them, or oh, I don't like them very much, right away. And that snap judgment is going to interfere with our ability to assess the totality of that person's application. And so we don't want to be in a situation when we're making a snap judgment. We want to be able to ask everybody all the same questions and get all the information so that we don't make a judgment based on the first thing that we hear. We want to make sure that our questions are job related. If they're not job related, then they're not really helping us determine who's the best candidate for the job. And that, of course, opens us up for legal problems because we then have low reliability, and if we have low reliability, then we're more likely to illegally discriminate and use non-job related criteria to make decisions. Negative information. Sometimes we might get information and we assess a negative label to it right away, and we want to be careful of making those attributions too quickly, or recognizing that not every candidate's going to be perfect. Somebody may have an issue that that was a past problem that's not a current problem, and we need to sort of think about how to manage that. And also interviewer memory. It's very, very difficult to remember when you're sitting with a bunch of candidates in front of you to remember all the nuances of every single candidate. So it's really hard because they all sound alike after a while. So our goal, of course, is that we want to be able to write down information about each of the candidates as soon as it's fresh in our head. We want to make sure we have very structured job-related questions. We want to make sure that we're not judging right away, but we're really using all the information we have available to us to make the best decision for the company. I remember I did some research, I think I may have mentioned this in class, about how we determine someone who's qualified for a job. And we asked people a snap judgment, about whether or not, just looking at the resume, whether or not someone was qualified for the job. And the snap judgment of many people was, this person is not qualified, or they're less qualified, even though the resume was the same. The only thing that differed was the name on it. So many times we'll make snap judgments based on race, based on sex, based on sexual orientation or gender identity or any disability, all those things. So we want to be really careful that we're not allowing those snap judgments to interfere with our ability to assess the candidate more accurately. So how do we improve the validity? We do job analysis. We make sure that we've got a good, solid job analysis that knows exactly what's required of the job, and then we can determine what KSAs are needed so that we can attest for them appropriately. We want to ask very standard, structured questions so that we can compare information. If we can, use rating scales. So as the candidate leaves on a 1 to 10 scale, or a 1 to 5 scale, or even a 1 to 7 scale, we can rate the answers to the questions, and we can get a better sense of whether or not this person is doing a good job. Then we can do a training, making sure people are trained on how to ask the questions, how to do standardization, how to take notes when they're doing things, how to ask more appropriate, more accurate types of questions. And lastly, we want to see if we can have more of a behavioral or situational format in our questions, because behavioral and situational questions are much better at getting at someone's ability to perform a job than if we simply just ask them open-ended questions. So let's take it to the next slide, which is, how do we set up a behavioral question or a situational question format? A behavioral question is asking, give me an example of you doing this behavior. So it might be something that you did in the past, or a scenario that you had to deal with in the past, and how did you handle it? A situational question is a hypothetical question, and that person may not have necessarily experienced it, but what you're assessing in your situational question is how well someone can talk through a particular situation and how they would handle it, because it gives you a good sense of what their personality is like and how they would handle it in real life. So in a behavioral related question, old formats are asking things like, how motivated are you? And think about that question, right? How motivated are you? How many of us would actually say, I'm not motivated at all? We're all going to say we're highly motivated. So now we have a question that asks you something, and everybody gives me the same answer. So the question is useless because I'm not really getting differences in answers. So why ask the question? The goal of asking these questions is to differentiate between the candidates. I want to hear a wide variety of responses and know which ones will work and which ones will not work. And so I want questions that will give me a variety of answers. So asking a dumb question like, how motivated are you, is never going to get you a variety of responses. It's going to get you one response. I'm highly motivated. That's it. So a better way to ask that question is, describe a situation in which you were highly motivated. Why were you motivated? So you might say, well, I was getting a bad grade in class, or these are the things that I did in order to improve my grade. I went and I talked to the professor, I went and I did extra homework, I did tutoring, and I was really motivated because this was material that I really liked, but I was mad that I wasn't performing well. And so it gives me insight into your tenacity and into your how resilient you are, if you are faced with a situation that may put up a barrier for your success. How did you work through it? So that tells me a lot about that. Another question, what are your weaknesses? No one wants to tell their real weaknesses. If anything, people might say, oh, my weakness is that I expect everybody to be as hardworking and as loyal as I am. And that's just such a bogus question, right? And I used to answer questions like that because I'd get these stupid questions. What's your weakness? Who wants to let people know your weakness? So a better question in that situation would be, give me an example of what happened when someone was less than satisfied with your work. Because that really forces the person to say, oh yeah, they didn't really like it when I did that, and I really needed to figure out how to better handle that situation. And this is what I learned from that experience, and this is how I've changed over time. And so, they want to know, again, what's your resilience like? Even if you were in a situation where something bad happened, how did you fix it? How did you make good on it? Lastly, what kind of decision-making style do you have? No one wants to say they're authoritarian and they crack whips. What they want to know, though, is how do you make decisions, and what's the process that you use to kind of manage it? So I can ask you what your style is, or I can tell you to talk me through a tough decision that you made. That's going to tell me your decision-making style much better than you just giving me some word that you learned in class, right? These kind of questions are fairly common, and so it's really important that you, even if someone asks you one of these dumb old questions, right? What's your weakness? How motivated are you? What's your decision-making style? Give them a behavior. Give them a solid example, because it's those solid examples that are going to make you stand out as a candidate. Particularly if you give them an answer that really pleases them, not because you want to please them, but because you're giving them a truthful answer that also happens to please them. So even if someone asks you one of those old format kind of questions, you want to be able to give a good answer, and so always give them great examples. So in someone says, what are your weaknesses? Well, you can say, well, let me give you an example of a situation that I needed to work through. I bombed on this particular project for my company, and I had, and I was there. These were these concerns that I had, and I realized there were certain things that I needed to do differently. So this is the way I educated myself. This is how I changed my behaviors, and ultimately, when I had another project opportunity, I did much better at it, and my boss really appreciated the changes that I made in the way I handled things. So that's the kind of way you want to answer that question, even if they don't ask you the question directly, right? So, other selection tests. Well, we've got a couple of different types of tests. Ability tests are broken down into things like cognitive ability tests, physical ability tests and psychomotor tests. And as you can see there, cognitive ability tests are really great predictors, but they tend to be more culturally biased. For example, they'll ask a question, cup and blank. And the typical question, the typical answer to this, as many people who write these tests would argue, should be cup and saucer, because the assumption is that the saucer goes underneath the cup and then people will drink from their cup that way. But that is also based on a particular socioeconomic class. Most people in society today don't have cups and saucers. That's fine china. It's fine dishware. Most people have mugs. I have mugs. I don't even think that I have cups and saucers in my house, even though I know the association. A kid who grows up in a poor socioeconomic situation doesn't understand cup and saucer. If they grew up in a society, in a culture that didn't use cups and saucers, for example, if they grew up in a developing nation or things like that, they don't know what a cup and saucer is. Does that necessarily mean that they're unintelligent? And it doesn't. It means that they don't understand that cultural reference. And so that's part of the problem of developing these intelligence tests, is that they are really anchored to a particular cultural norm of being white, upper middle class, or upper class society. And what do you understand those norms of that society? Everybody assumes that that's the standard, and in fact it's not. Our goal is that we want to have something that really gets at someone's fundamental intelligence, and we have to figure out ways to do that better. It's always something that people are constantly working on in the arena of psychology, is how do we measure G, or intelligence, is what it's called. Applicants really don't like these kind of cognitive ability tests. They tend to have very strong negative visceral reactions to them. And so, of course, these negative reactions can create a problem for us, because we give them the test, they might feel very frustrated, and they may not want to take the job after we offer it to them later on, even if they scored really well on the test. Other types of ability tests are physical ability tests, where, again, we test them for their physical capabilities, and if they can perform those physical capabilities on the test, that means obviously that they should be able to perform those physical capabilities on the job. They're very content valid in that manner, and they're also a really good predictor of performance if the job requires certain physical ability tests. And people like those better because they can really see the relationship between, I performed well on the test, I should get the job. I didn't perform well on the test, I won't get the job. Psychomotor tests are also a great example of a way to assess abilities, and it's basically how your brain processes and then how your body responds in conjunction with that. And I'm going to show you some video clips of some things that give you a good example of what a psychomotor test is when we get into class. Personality tests are another option. The acronym that people have used traditionally in psychology for the Big Five personality test is called OCEAN, which is getting openness to new experiences, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and then it used to be called neuroticism, hence OCEAN worked perfectly well. Now it's called emotional stability. So obviously, emotional stability sounds much better than being neurotic. Obviously what we call it has changed slightly, but the bottom line is it's getting at these four major personality traits, and whether or not you're introverted, how open or closed you are to new experiences, how conscientious you are, and how stable you are, sort of on this continuums. And these are really great predictors of people's ability to do a job well. The one element that is the most able to predict is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is really good at predicting how well someone can perform on the job. Next probably is agreeableness, but even then agreeableness can vary from day to day, so there's some elements in this measure that are not always very reliable, but conscientiousness, very reliable, very valid, very good predictor. We may want to look at someone's extroversion, introversion score because certain types of jobs require people to be more extroverted. For example, outside sales, right? Very challenging job for an introvert. You have to be willing to press the flesh and to have conversations with complete strangers in a way that's very comfortable. And an introvert may not be able to do that well for a long period of time. They can do it for short bursts, but not forever. So extroversion may be something that we might want to look at as a screening tool for certain types of jobs. Integrity tests are also important. We're getting at people, how honest they are, and we can have paper and pencil tests as a rule, and they usually have either a hidden purpose, where people aren't clear what the test is measuring, or where they can be very explicit. Sometimes people are prone to try to second guess the questions and try to give what they think is a socially acceptable answer, but people can recognize, there's ways to recognize whether or not someone's faking. And in those types of tests, there's certain key questions and wordings and the way that they do it and the way that they're designed that really uncovers whether or not someone is actually faking their answers and just trying to give the answer that everybody wants to hear. I would never steal. Well, that's not true, because people steal things all the time. You steal pencils and paper from your office. You steal paper clips, from the company closet. These things happen all the time. So saying that you've never stolen, or you maybe you would never steal, is always a concern. So polygraphs used to be given as a type of tool to test whether or not someone would be a liar. And we really can't use it for pre-employment screening, because polygraphs are about a specific event or a specific issue. So I can put someone in a polygraph and test them for whether or not they stole money, or test them whether or not they killed somebody, or test them whether or not they did something that they said that they didn't do, because I can get at whether or not their response to a particular question is, tells me they may be lying to me about that particular issue. So we can use it for an investigation, but we can't use it for pre-employment screening, and we certainly cannot use it as evidence in and of itself in a court of law. What that polygraph test tells us is this person's probably lying, and then you have to go find the information to support that supposition that they're actually lying. So you have to work on it that way. Next slide. How do we make the selection decisions? And the last two slides get at this. This is part of the placement aspect. We can do several different tools. We can use a single predictor to choose whether or not we hire someone. So basically, when it comes to someone who's going to come work at McDonald's, do they have a pulse? Yes. Can they read and write, basically? So if they can read and write, then they have all the skills that we need in order to be able to do the job, and we'll train them for everything that they need to know once they get in there. So single predictors are good for very, very, very simplistic jobs, very easy jobs where most of the time we're going to train them on the job to do something. And a lot of very basic entry-level sort of fast food types of jobs are really good for that. And I've worked more than my share of them, so I understand that. Multiple hurdles, though, are the next level up. It's where we want to make sure people pass every hurdle, that they do well on every aspect of the hiring process, because they need to be good in all those areas. And we typically use multiple hurdle tests for jobs that are highly dangerous or require high levels of skill, and that low levels of skill in any one of those areas is going to be a detriment to the company and to that individual. For example, we don't want a pilot that knows how to take off really well, but maybe they're not so good at landing. They need to be good at everything, and high level good at everything. So they have to pass every single hurdle in order to be able to do that. Our last category is it's a compensatory approach. And this is where people can be high in some areas and low in others, and you're looking for the totality of their application. Do they meet the minimum needs, but then it's okay if they're a little bit lower in some area than others. For example, we can do clinical judgment, which is me as the manager. I'm just making an assessment based on my gut feel. So I'm looking at these criteria for someone who's applying for a business school, an MBA program. So they have a moderate range GPA at 2.7. It was probably a little on the low side. but their GMAT scores are really good. They have great letters of recommendation from their current employers, and they have 5 years of good work experience. And so I might look at that application packet and say, well, their GPA is a little bit low, but the MBA is about training people to be good managers. And if they have really good work experience and everybody says they're a fabulous person, in terms of their letters of recommendation, I might be more likely to accept them into the MBA program than reject them. We can also do this statistically, where I might have a raw score attached to each one of these categories, where a GPA might score, on a 1 to 5 scale, that score might be a 3. But it's weighted less than, say, the GMAT score, which might be weighted more. So a GMAT of a 720 is probably close to perfect, and so I might give that, a 5 out of 5 on that scale. The letters of recommendation. Again, some people will write glowing letters of recommendation even when the person's not all that glowing. So it's important to have a good letter, but I might weight it slightly less. So I give it a good score, but I might weight it slightly less in terms of the other factors. And then the number of years of work experience. If they had good years of work experience where they're sort of in management training and they're really in that direction, I might weight that heavier and also give them a good score for the amount of experience that they have. And so I can weight it and do a weighted average on it and then come up with a score. And if people meet the minimum cutoff score, we're good. And if they don't meet that minimum cutoff score, then we will probably not accept them into the program. So clinical judgment is not me doing any math, but me making the judgment in my own mind based on my experience. And the statistical method is where I actually apply numbers to it, and then I come up with sort of compensation and compensatory models and decide that they're weak here, but they're strong here, and this will work out well. And then I make my decision to accept to hire someone into the program at that point. Once then we have all that information, then we have to decide, how do we make a selection decision? Do we do it on rank, or particularly when you're in a unionized environment, as the last slide says, do we do it based on seniority or test scores or all sorts of things? And the first thing we might look at is, how well do people do on the test? Whether we do it in clusters or whether we do it from the top down until all the positions are filled, or we hire everybody who passes and nobody who fails. So we have to decide what that rank will be. Then, if we have to choose between two candidates, then we might turn to seniority. And the person with the most seniority, if they have the similar skills, the person with most seniority would probably win in that situation, and they would get the job. Except, as we talked about, in circumstances where we may have issues of doing affirmative action, where we would absolutely want to make sure that, if we have equal candidates, that everybody has, they're equal. We want to use the affirmative action decision in order to bring in more diversity into the company. So that's selection, and thank you very much.